Before the war in Iraq, the Gulf War, and the liberation of Kuwait, or even before Saddam Hussein, you had the Kingdom of Iraq. A kingdom ruled by the Hashemites, the royal family over in Jordan, which at one point formed a very short-lived confederation with its neighbor, giving us the all but now forgotten Arab Federation. The United Arab Republic seems to get all the attention. But Iraq's history before the rise of the Ba'ath Party is worth remembering. From its first king, who also briefly ruled over an unrecognized kingdom in Syria, to its last, who acceded to the throne when he was just 3 years old. Oh, and as always, for any of our subscribers out there, consider clicking on the bell to get all notifications. That way you'll never miss out on any upcoming videos. And even if you're not a subscriber, like roughly 90% of our viewers, you can always subscribe, like this video, or comment. It really does help out the channel and means a lot to us. Following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I, the idea was put forward by the League of Nations to create mandates for the territories formerly occupied by the defeated Central Powers. The mandate system was aimed to guide former colonies and territories towards self-governance. However, until that point, they were to be placed under the administration of a more developed country known as the Mandatory Power, which was responsible for their, well, development. The mandates were divided into 3 classes. Class A being the most developed and therefore the closest to independence, Class B being less developed and requiring more control, and finally Class C being the least developed and requiring direct control. The League of Nations oversaw this process, though many in the former Ottoman Empire believed it was simply European colonialism by another name. In case you're wondering, Iraq, or as it was then called, Mesopotamia, was designated as a Class A mandate. At the San Remo Conference in April 1920, Britain was officially awarded the mandate for Mesopotamia and promptly began replacing former Ottoman officials. London also imposed a new tax for burial in the Wadi us-Salam cemetery in Najaf, which proved deeply unpopular among the region's Shia community. This resulted in a fatwa declaring that service in the British administration was unlawful. A fatwa being a legal ruling on a point of Islamic law given by a qualified Islamic jurist in response to a question posed by a private individual, judge, or government. Anyway, discontent continued to fester in Mesopotamia until the Iraqi Revolution of 1920, a major uprising which aimed to establish a fully independent Arab state. The British quickly deployed military forces to suppress the rebellion, including 2 squadrons of the Royal Air Force. Allegedly, chemical weapons such as mustard gas were also used by the British against rebel forces in southern Mesopotamia, although the extent and effectiveness of their use remains the subject of historical debate. The revolt was eventually suppressed by the end of 1920, with 2,050 to 10,000 Iraqis and 1,000 British soldiers being killed. In the aftermath, the British government, under the advice of its new colonial secretary, Winston Churchill, decided to shift its approach in the region. And so, following the Cairo Conference of 1921, Britain opted to terminate its mandate for Mesopotamia, establishing a monarchy under Faisal bin al-Hussein bin Ali al-Hashemi, an Arab leader who had been involved in the Arab Revolt during World War I. Aside from his role in the Arab Revolt, also known as the Great Arab Revolt, where he worked alongside figures like T.E. Lawrence, aka Lawrence of Arabia, Faisal briefly served as king of the unrecognized Arab kingdom of Syria until he was forced into exile following the Franco-Syrian War. If you'd like to learn more about the Arab kingdom of Syria, we've actually got a video about that. Anyway, Faisal's father, Hussein bin Ali al-Hashimi, the Sharif and Emir of Mecca, had also successfully led a rebellion against the Ottomans and established the Hashemite kingdom of Hejaz in 1916. However, in 1921, few people living in Mesopotamia knew who Faisal was or had ever heard his name before. With the help of British officials, though, he successfully won the popular support of the minority Sunni population. The Shia majority remained lukewarm about Faisal, and his appearance at the port of Basra was met with indifference, however. Many Shia had, in fact, not responded to Hussein's call to join the Arab Revolt, as the Sharif and Emir of Mecca was a Sunni from Hejaz. To legitimize Faisal's rule, a plebiscite was organized by the British, which reportedly yielded an overwhelmingly favorable result, with Faisal receiving 96% of the vote. However, it is widely believed that the process was heavily influenced by British authorities who orchestrated the outcome to ensure Faisal's selection. Nonetheless, he was crowned King of Iraq on August 23, 1921, a date which also marked the establishment of the Kingdom of Iraq, or Mandatory Iraq. Iraq was itself a new entity created out of the former Ottoman vilayets, or provinces, of Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra. Ottoman vilayets were usually named after their capital, and thus the Basra vilayet was southern Iraq. Given this background, there was no sense of Iraqi nationalism or even Iraqi national identity when Faisal took his throne. And in keeping with this, the band at Faisal's coronation played God Save the King, as Iraq did not yet have a national anthem and would not have one until 1932. Notwithstanding the formal sovereignty of the Iraqi king, a treaty of alliance was concluded with the United Kingdom in 1922. Known as the Anglo-Iraqi Treaty, it provided the British with a role in the administration and governance of Iraq, including control of its foreign policy. Faisal nevertheless continued to advocate for Arab nationalist causes and envisioned ultimately bringing the French mandates of Syria and Lebanon together with the British mandate of Palestine under his rule. Keenly aware that his power base lay with the Sunnis of Iraq, who comprised a significant minority, Faisal understood that if Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine were incorporated into his realm, Sunnis would comprise the majority of his subjects, making the Shia and ethnic Kurds minorities. However, during the Great Syrian Revolt of 1925, a general uprising across the state of Syria and Greater Lebanon which aimed to bring an end to French occupation, Faisal was not particularly supportive of the rebels, partly because of British pressure and partly because he had reason to believe the French might be open to installing a Hashemite to govern Syria on their behalf. One of the first major challenges faced by the fledgling kingdom was the Mosul question, a territorial dispute between Iraq and Turkey over the oil-rich former Mosul vilayet. Despite relentless opposition from Turkey, which argued that Mosul had historically always been Ottoman territory and that the Kurds and Turks were not racially separable, meaning that Arabs constituted only a minority of the population, the League of Nations recommended that Iraq should retain Mosul, and Turkey reluctantly agreed to the decision on the condition of continued British supervision by signing the Frontier Treaty of 1926. Iraq did, however, agree to give a 10% royalty on Mosul's oil deposits to Turkey for the next 25 years. Another pivotal moment in the early history of the kingdom was the signing of the Anglo-Iraqi Treaty of 1930. This set the stage for Iraq's formal independence, which was achieved on October 3, 1932, when the Kingdom of Iraq, or as it was formerly known, the Hashemite Kingdom of Iraq, joined the League of Nations. Despite this milestone, the British still retained significant control over Iraq's military and economic affairs, particularly its burgeoning oil industry. Shortly after gaining independence, Baghdad declared that Kuwait was rightfully part of Iraq, arguing that the territory had loosely been under the authority of the Basra vilayet for centuries until the British had severed it from Ottoman influence after the First World War. It was on this basis the Iraqi government argued that Kuwait was a British imperialist invention. Although I'm not trying to be that guy, but the same could be said for the Kingdom of Iraq. Anyway, these claims were not pursued aggressively during Faisal's reign, as Iraq was still under British influence and London protected Kuwait as a separate entity under its treaty system. Faisal would, however, again butt heads with the British over his handling of the so-called Assyrian affair. The Assyrians are an indigenous ethnic group native to Mesopotamia. Historically, they spoke Akkadian, a now extinct East Semitic language, and during the Neo-Assyrian period, ruled over the largest empire in the ancient world. Assyrians are almost exclusively Christian, with most adhering to the East and West Syriac liturgical rites of Christianity. And, because of this, they were targeted by Ottoman forces during World War I in what later came to be known as the Assyrian Genocide, or Sefo, a Syriac word literally meaning sword. Between 275,000 and 300,000 people, or roughly 2/3 of the entire Assyrian population, are estimated to have been killed by the Ottoman Empire and their Kurdish allies. Those who survived the genocide were relocated by the British to refugee camps in what eventually became the Kingdom of Iraq, and, back in 1921, some were enlisted in the Assyrian levies, a military force under British command. The levies are not without their own questionable past, having participated in the violent suppression of the Iraqi Revolt of 1920 and the Kirkuk Massacre of 1924. And so, some in the kingdom viewed the Assyrian levies as British proxies who aimed to undermine Iraq. In 1932, shortly after the Kingdom of Iraq secured its formal independence, the Patriarch of the Assyrian Church of the East called for establishing an autonomous Assyrian homeland within Iraq and sought support from the United Kingdom for presenting its case before the League of Nations. Following a series of clashes along the border with Syria in late 1933, anti-Christian propaganda gained traction in the kingdom, with rumors circulating that the Christians were planning to blow up bridges and poison drinking wells in major Iraqi cities. As this occurred, the Iraqi army moved north to crush what Baghdad labeled an Assyrian revolt. And they did so by executing every Assyrian male they found, regardless of whether they were armed or not. Things escalated further when the army attacked the town of Simele, where over the next few days an estimated 3,000 to 6,000 Assyrians were killed. On August 18th, Iraqi troops entered Mosul and were given an enthusiastic reception by its Muslim inhabitants. Triumphant arches were erected in the city and decorated with melons pierced with daggers symbolizing the heads of dead Assyrians. Bakr Sedki, an Iraqi general of Kurdish origin who led the army during the massacre of Simele, likewise paraded through the streets of Baghdad and was later even promoted. While the British strongly condemned the massacre of Assyrians and initially called on Faisal to punish those responsible, London ultimately stood by Iraq and rejected an international inquiry into the killings, giving rise to the notion of a British betrayal among Iraq's remaining Assyrians. Faisal died the following year in 1933. His son, Ghazi, ascended to the throne and quickly positioned himself as a critic of continued British influence in Iraq. Ghazi's reign was characterized by nationalist rhetoric and efforts to consolidate power, but he was generally considered an ineffective ruler when compared to his father. And in 1936, General Sadki staged a coup which replaced Iraq's civilian government with a military one. Don't forget, but the Kingdom of Iraq was a constitutional monarchy and had a bicameral parliament. Ghazi, however, supported Sadki and declared his desire to annex Kuwait. That being said, Sadki was assassinated 10 months later while in Mosul, and Ghazi died in a car crash in 1939. Rumors of foul play abounded, with some suggesting that the British were involved due to Ghazi's anti-colonial stance. Ghazi was succeeded by his only son, Faisal II, but as he was only 3 years old, his uncle, Prince Abdallah, served as regent. In 1941, a pro-Axis government led by Rashid Ali al-Gilani orchestrated another coup, which intended to use the ongoing war in Europe to press for full Iraqi independence following the limited independence granted to the kingdom in 1932. To that end, al-Gilani and other members of the so-called Golden Square, a group of nationalist officers within the Iraqi military, worked with German intelligence and accepted military assistance from the Axis powers. The British, understanding the importance of Iraq's oil reserves and its strategic location in the Middle East, were not going to sit idle, and the ensuing Anglo-Iraqi War culminated in the reoccupation of Iraq by British forces. The regent, Abdallah, who fled to Jordan, was reinstated, and British control over the country was reaffirmed. In 1953, Faisal II officially assumed the throne, but his reign was overshadowed by widespread dissatisfaction with the monarchy's close ties to Britain and its inability to address growing socioeconomic issues. That is not to say Faisal did nothing. During his reign, Faisal initiated large-scale plans for the modernization of Greater Baghdad. The goal of this ambitious project was to improve and develop infrastructure and housing, provide essential public buildings, reform the building industry itself, and train future Iraqi architects. Working alongside famed American architect Frank Lloyd Wright, the plan for a Greater Baghdad aimed to build a cultural center, opera house, and university on the outskirts of the capital. The most thoroughly developed aspect of the plan was the opera house, which would have been built on an island in the middle of the Tigris River, together with museums and a towering gilded statue of Harun al-Rashid, the fifth caliph of the Abbasid Caliphate. However, an ever-widening gap between the wealthy political elites, landowners, and other supporters of the regime on one hand, and the poverty of workers and peasants on the other, intensified opposition to Faisal's government. What's more, the decision by his regent, but later confirmed by Faisal himself, to sign the Anglo-Iraqi Treaty of 1948 that permitted the British to continue to maintain a military presence in Iraq seemingly forever was deeply unpopular. And when the young king decided to join the Baghdad Pact in 1955, a Western-aligned mutual defense treaty, huge protests erupted throughout Iraq. A few years before this, in 1952, the Egyptian monarchy had been overthrown by a radical pan-Arabist army officer, Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser. Then, in 1956, Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal to keep all of its revenue for Egyptian development. But the canal's owners, Britain and France, immediately launched an invasion of Egypt to regain control. an invasion that also saw the new state of Israel attack Egypt, capturing the Sinai Peninsula. Faisal, at the advice of his pro-Western prime minister, Nouri al-Said, maintained a relatively restrained position during the ensuing Suez crisis, largely reflecting Iraq's alignment with Western powers and its role in the Baghdad Pact. As such, Iraq avoided outright condemnation of Britain and France, alongside Israel, which were involved in military action to retake the Suez Canal. This fueled internal discontent back in Iraq, and opposition groups began to organize in secret, modeling themselves after the Egyptian Free Officers movement that overthrew the Egyptian monarchy. Then, on February 1, 1958, Syria officially joined with Egypt to form a new country called the United Arab Republic. Iraq did not recognize the new state, and rather, on February 14th, Faisal and his cousin, King Hussein of Jordan, declared the Hashemite Arab Federation, more commonly known as the Arab Federation. As Faisal was older than Hussein, he became head of state. However, many Iraqis were suspicious of this ultimately short-lived confederation because Britain vocally supported it, and they thought it a ploy to continue London's influence over the region. Then, in March, Yemen joined the UAR by forming a loose confederation called the United Arab States, while Syria began providing support for the Arab nationalist movement in Lebanon that was trying to depose the pro-Western government there. If successful, Lebanon likely would have joined the UAR, which in turn would isolate Iraq and Jordan from the rest of the Arab world. And so, Prime Minister al-Said decided to provide military aid to Lebanon. This wasn't enough, and so the decision was made to actually send Iraqi troops. However, this proved a fateful mistake, and the Free Officers movement inside the Iraqi military decided to act. Led by Brigadier Abd al-Karim Qasim and Colonel Abdullah Salam Arif, the movement orders issued to Iraqi units to go to Jordan, passing by Baghdad, provided the perfect cover to launch a coup. Arif directed the 20th Infantry Brigade toward the capital, while Qasim and the 19th Infantry Brigade remained in reserve. On July 14, 1958, a broadcasting station in Baghdad was taken over, and a radio broadcast was made proclaiming a republic and an end to the monarchy. An interim government was then announced, consisting of a 3-man committee until elections could be organized at a later date. 2 groups of soldiers were then dispatched to deal with the king and the prime minister. King Faisal was then at the Rahab Palace, which was guarded by an elite unit of soldiers known as the Iraqi Royal Guard that were not part of the army chain of command, but rather the personal authority of the monarch. With the king at the royal palace were his uncle, Crown Prince Abd Allah, his wife, Crown Princess Hiam, Abdallah's mother, Princess Nafisa, Faisal's aunt, Princess Abdia, alongside a number of other family members and servants. The Rahab Palace was not to be Faisal's permanent residence, as a new palace was then under construction, which would become his residence following his planned wedding to Egyptian princess Fazil Hami Sultan, the only daughter of Prince Muhammad Ali Ibrahim of Egypt and the Ottoman princess Zahra Hanzadeh Sultan. Despite the presence of the Iraqi royal guard at the palace, no resistance was offered by order of Prince Abdallah. Still, fire was exchanged between the royal guard and soldiers from the 20th Infantry Brigade. This attracted the attention of an army officer stationed nearby, Captain Abdul Sattar al-Abusi, who had been training troops at a compound on the outskirts of Baghdad, and so he gathered some of his men and headed over to the palace. Al-Abusi then reportedly ordered his men to shell the royal residence. Negotiations soon commenced for the surrender of the royal guard and what to do with the royal family trapped inside. An agreement was reached in which the royal family would surrender in return for a guarantee they would not be harmed and would be taken elsewhere. Shortly after this, Faisal emerged accompanied by other members of the royal family and royal guard. They were all unarmed according to official sources. What happened next really depends on who you ask. Those behind the coup, namely Qasim and Arif, later claimed they intended to exile the king and prince. That's not what happened, though. And this gave rise to an alternative theory, being that those behind the coup always planned to kill the royal family, ending the Hashemite dynasty in Iraq, and ensuring the British could not attempt to restore the king or any other future heir to the throne via a counter-revolution. And so it was that al-Abusi and a group of soldiers entered the palace grounds and opened fire on the royal family, shooting the 23-year-old king, who earlier that day was scheduled to fly to Istanbul to see his fiancée. Several royal family members were killed outright, others were badly injured, including King Faisal and Prince Abdallah. Only one person survived the massacre, Abdallah's wife, Crown Princess Hiam. Although she was shot in the leg, she was otherwise unharmed, likely because some of the soldiers were members of her family tribe. And this means her description of what followed is the only account we have from those not directly involved in the coup. The official narrative is that King Faisal died of his wounds while being transported in a car to a nearby hospital. According to the princess, however, this is not what happened. Rather, she claims that al-Abusi walked up to the mortally injured Faisal, shooting the king point blank in his head, then doing the same to her husband. As the princess later said, Faisal's head was split in two like a coconut. The members of the royal family, both the dead and those still alive, were then taken by car to the Ministry of Defense. But along the way, the king and crown prince's bodies were dumped on the side of the road. A mob then stripped the king's lifeless body naked before hanging it from a streetlight. The crown prince's body, meanwhile, was stripped naked and dragged through the street by a car before having its hands and feet hacked off and being hung from a balcony. Once the mob moved on, the bodies were collected and driven to Al-Rashid Military Hospital for identification. Following this, King Faisal II's corpse was unceremoniously dumped in a hole near the hospital, while the rest of the dead were cremated, the remains being disposed of in the Tigris River. Prime Minister al-Said went into hiding, but he was captured the next day as he sought to make his escape. He was shot dead and buried the same day, but an angry mob disinterred his corpse and dragged it through the streets of Baghdad, where it was hung up, burned, and mutilated, ultimately being run over repeatedly by a municipal bus until his corpse was unrecognizable. The 1958 Iraqi coup, also known as the 14 July Revolution, ultimately brought an end to the Kingdom of Iraq and the Arab Federation. Qasim became prime minister of a new Republic of Iraq, while Arif became deputy prime minister. In 1959, Iraq broke off relations with Britain and the United States and instead made alliances with communist countries such as the Soviet Union. Qasim would himself, however, be overthrown in a coup in 1963, which brought to power the Ba'ath Party, which ruled over the country until 2003. Faisal II's remains were eventually disinterred during the rule of Saddam Hussein and reinterred next to his father, King Ghazi, in a marble tomb in a restored Iraqi royal cemetery. Anyway, I'm going to give the Kingdom of Iraq a 9 on the Ghost Countries Index. I really think there's no disputing the legacy of the Kingdom of Iraq on the country, and the violent downfall of the monarchy paved the way for the eventual rise of the Ba'ath Party. It also resulted in decades of instability and conflict from which modern Iraq is finally just beginning to emerge. But, as always, I'd like to hear your thoughts, so please let me know down in the comment section. Also, a huge thank you once again to all of our supporters over on Patreon, and if you'd like to help support the channel too, there's a link down in the description.